Mr Chair.
Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to address new Clause 6 in the two supplementary order papers, and I thank the member for explaining that there were two supplementary order papers. I haven't been particularly part of this debate, and I realised I was looking at the old one, not the new one. So we've got supplementary order paper number 15 that amends supplementary order paper number 472. And new Clause 6 replaces 16 weeks with 22 weeks in the provisions that relate to a person who gives birth to either two or more children as a result of one pregnancy or where the child is born with an impairment that would entitle that person to a government-funded disability support service. The first thing that I noticed is that the amendment is from 16 weeks to 22 weeks. And I note that the legislation as it still is on legislation.gov.nz still says 14 weeks, and I appreciate that this is the transition that the government has actually followed from 14 to 18 weeks, but the 16 weeks doesn't kick in until July next year. So I just want to check with the member that this is an appropriate amendment from 16 to 22, given that the current provision is for 14, notwithstanding the fact the government has changed the law to 16. So that's just a matter of clarification. It would be useful to make sure that we are clear on that. I'm also interested to know why the 22 weeks and the 26 weeks was chosen. I appreciate the rationale that the member has given, given that the original intention was to shift to 26 weeks for all parents. But having a look around the world at overseas examples where there is extra provision given for multiple births, there seems to be quite a range in different countries as to what the additional amount of time given to parents who do have multiple births. And actually I couldn't find a lot of evidence of extra time given to parents where the child is born with some form of impairment. So I'd be interested to know what the evidence was that the member used to land on the 22 weeks in the case of new Clause 6.1 and the 26 weeks in the case of new Clause 6.2. Because obviously it is important, if we are going to narrow the focus of this legislation down, which is what Clause 6 does, it is a narrowing of the bill down to a small number of parents, or a smaller number of parents, that is being done with some kind of evidence base. I know that the member wanted to use a strong evidence base in the wider bill. I think it's important, regardless of what the purpose of the narrowing is that Clause 6 places upon the legislation, that is still done with an evidence base. And from my very quick reading, there seems to be quite a number of divergent views around the world about what an appropriate additional amount of time for people with multiple births should be. I also raised the question whether children who suffer an impairment that would entitle them to a government-funded disability is broad enough. I think another member raised the question of fetal alcohol syndrome. There is a range of impairments that will require much more additional attention from parents for those children that are not necessarily covered by legislation. I appreciate this is probably a matter of definition. It's a matter of having a clause here which is easy to define, that has a narrow scope, and I appreciate that a lot of this has to do with the narrowing of the scope to reduce the cost of the legislation. But I do wonder whether the member took that into consideration and whether there was any consideration for those impairments that fall outside of that very narrow scope. Also, the question of 37 weeks gestation. I haven't heard yet an explanation as to why that 37 weeks was chosen. I'm sure there are good reasons for it, but that again is a specific number that has been chosen. There are examples of children who have been born viable after 37 weeks, but still come with the challenges of being premature.